Alrighty, welcome back to the channel, or hello if you're new here. Today I've got a melee tier list for Grenade Veteran. Let's go straight into the tier list. Alrighty, just a couple of things before I go into the explanation of each weapon. I'm judging these weapons based on how adaptable, how versatile, how it interacts with grenades, how it can be used as a tool or a force multiplier to a build. You'll also notice there is no S+ tier. I don't believe there is any weapon that is in a league of its own. However, and I will explain where necessary, for example, everything in the S tier is on par with each other. I don't think anything stands out. They have their pros and cons, or their strengths and weaknesses for each. I'll explain that, but just so you know when I go further into the tier list. And one more thing as well, just like the range tier list, this video is meant to be used with any of my future or current build videos. You can mix and match any of the melee or range weapons from those tier lists. After this, I will have a Darktide interactions video for Grenade Veteran, showing all the interactions with the blessings and grenades, as well as the talents and little mechanics that you can do in game, as well as a little bit of game knowledge. And those 3 videos, I'll update when necessary, and just use that in combination as an online resource for any other video. Now, starting at the top of the S tier, again, power sword, knife, dueling sword are all on par with each other. What separates them is the power sword is lacking in mobility, but it has by far the best horde killing potential. It's got a lot of brute force potential. That's very much what it is. It's the brute force weapon. Grenade Veteran by nature is a brute force build. AI director sends a pack at you, turns up the aggression. Grenade Veteran blows a hole through it. That's how it works. In terms of single target breakpoints, you're still hitting very consistent 1 to 3 shot breakpoints, depending on your build, depending on the move set. I do recommend the Mark 6. The knife has the highest mobility. There are some shenanigans on the DS where it can be better, but as a base, the knife is better. It still has great single target breakpoints. It synergizes with bleed and rending from Uncanny Strike. It's just the generalist weapon. It's better at horde clear than the dueling sword. If we're talking about the Mark 6, it's got the horizontal heavy into a light. It's very easy to chain that attack and recombo it if you mess up the combo. It's just a very good all-purpose weapon with really no clear weakness. Now, the dueling sword is incredibly potent as a single target weapon. You're basically holding onto a crack grenade is what the dueling sword is. It's got fantastic mobility. If the base of the knife is a 10, the dueling sword base is a 9, whereas the power sword might be like a 5. Whereas the power sword has like 10 in horde killing, the knife might be an 8, and the dueling sword is a 5. And then the knife and the power sword are 8 for single target breakpoints, but the dueling sword's a 10. So it does struggle against the horde killing capabilities, but it has more than enough damage. The recent buff to Serrated Blade giving 2 stacks on melee attack, that actually does help a lot for the horde killing and kind of shores up a weakness of the dueling sword. All 3 of these weapons are fantastic. That's what separates these 3 weapons. Now, on to the power sword specifically. It's a little unique in the sense that it doesn't have a lot of blessings that really work that well with grenades. It's more so that it just plays well with Grenade Veteran. You use a grenade, it brings their health down to a threshold that's very easy for the power sword to finish off. It innately is really good against carapace, which is what shredded grenades are weak versus. In terms of blessings, you're always going to be taking power cycler. That's your best in slot, and then you're going to be combining it with usually Momentum or Brutal Momentum. That will give you the best horde killing if we're talking about the best single target breakpoints, but also boosting shredder grenades. Slaughterer improves dot damage or bleed damage, and then Sunder is the easiest blessing to get a lot of value with. It's the only blessing that allows a power sword to cleave through carapace, which is a very powerful mechanic to have, especially the higher you go into Havoc. You're just going to get spammed with a lot more crushes, armored rages, maulers. Very powerful blessing. Honorable mention to Rampage. It's an okay blessing, but it does not improve bleed damage. So I'll go over this in my Darktide interactions video, but especially if you're a newer player or you don't really go into the nitty-gritty stuff, there's a lot of blessings like Rampage where it gives a damage bonus, and you would assume it works with grenades. The reason it doesn't is it only improves the melee aspect of your damage coming from the sword. You'll have blessings that do one of 3 things. It improves the melee damage, the ranged damage, or total damage. Slaughterer is a blessing that improves total damage, including bleed. Rampage only improves the melee damage coming from the weapon, so there's really never a reason to pick Rampage over Slaughterer in my opinion. Also because Slaughterer gives access to a higher amount of damage, but it also improves cleave and impact. So honestly, yeah, there's just not really a reason to ever go Rampage. Supercharge is okay because it allows your grenades to deal with armor from an AoE perspective, but you can just kill each elite as they get towards you if you're kiting it well. So I don't see the need for it when the power sword is already killing armor within 1 to 3 shots anyway. Thrust is good, but it's redundant, it doesn't improve bleed damage, and it's more effective on the Mark III that has the horizontal heavies. I prefer the Mark VI, I just don't think this blessing is necessary. Wrath is another honorable mention. It's okay, not needed. Why would I take it when I have brutal momentum? Simple as. So you'll notice the 4 best blessings on the power sword: Power Cycler, Brutal Momentum, Slaughterer, and Sunder. Only one of them improves bleed damage, but again, it just comes down to the power sword works so well with Grenade Veteran. It just does everything that grenades are weak at. It plays into the strength of being a brute force build. Just a really powerful weapon, especially with a new buff where you don't get, or you don't lose the energized attacks on being hit. If it's still a displacement type attack, like from a Plague Ogre for example, you'll still lose the energized attacks, but keeping the uptime of those 3 attacks is a lot better. I do still think it needs work. I don't like the fact that Power Cycler must always be taken. I like it when there's a choice of best in slot for different builds, but you'll always take Power Cycler. You won't not take it regardless of build. I think it's just a little bit of a bad design in my opinion. I'm not a dev or a balance guy. That's just, I don't like how it feels. That's where I'm coming from. I don't like how it feels being forced into Power Cycler. If they just made the power sword have 3 energized attacks, and you know, if they did some tuning, I would much prefer that personally. You get what I'm trying to say. It just doesn't feel nice to always take Power Cycler. Now going on to the combat knife, very versatile weapon, like I was saying, highly mobile, good single target breakpoints, pretty good horde clear, all things considered. If you're using the right combos, you're either using double light dodge on repeat or heavy light on repeat with your dodges. Executor is a pretty decent blessing. On the Mark VI, you have the poke attack, so it's very easy to get those stacks. The Mark III is all about single target hits and overhead, so again, it's quite easy to keep these stacks in my opinion, or at least get some stacks, but this is one of the few blessings on the knife that actually improves your bleed damage. So think of Executor as basically the knife's version of Slaughterer on the power sword. It's not something that I take often, but again, you will notice the single target breakpoints, especially when Uncanny is proc, and again, it improves bleed damage from the shredder grenades. If you're taking some crit new build, Reciprocity and Desperado, Flesh Terror is a fantastic blessing, helps with horde clear, keeps bleed uptime so you don't need to use grenades on bosses for example, unless you need the stagger. Going back to that double light or heavy light combo into the horde, this is where a lot of your horde killing comes from the bleed stacks, because it does so well into unarmored and unyielding. Lacerate for the exact same reason. If you're not going a crit build, you can combine both with Serrated Blade, although I find less reason with Flesh Terror. However, if you have the points for Serrated Blade and Lacerate 6 stacks of bleed, it's very easy to do it, consistent. It's applying and proccing, doing something that you're going to be doing anyway, and you're not going to be hitting headshots on every single hit when it comes to a horde. So Lacerate does have a lot of value. I think it's quite good, plays well, especially the Mark VI knife. Mercy Killer, I think it's one of the weaker blessings. I prefer Lacerate or Flesh Terror personally. If you're taking Serrated Blade, especially Precision Strikes for example, that's a lot of weak spot damage. There's some cool interactions here. I think it kind of falls off compared to other options in Higher Havoc. Now going into the most important one, Uncanny Strike. That is the best in slot for the knife for Grenade Veteran. You throw a grenade, you hit let's say 100 enemies, and you can just whack whatever's in front of you on the head to ramp every single one of those bleed stacks. It doesn't matter what's in front of you, it will eventually die. What separates Grenade Veteran from the Flamer or Fire Staff is the base damage of the grenades. Depending on your build and stuff, you can do around 1200 damage to Reapers from the explosion damage, and then you have to realize that the bleed is front loaded, unlike the Flamer and Inferno Staff that need to ramp to their higher stacks. Grenade Veteran starts its chain with a ton ton of base damage and 6, 12 or 16 stacks of bleed dialing down, that's where the power comes from. Grenade Veteran's damage over time is front loaded. That's what makes it so powerful, especially if you're combining it with a pre-stacked uncanny strike, or even while the bleed and the grenades are being thrown out, you start getting your executor, for example. There's a lot of stuff that you can do to really maximize your grenades. Precognition, it's fine, but it's not needed. You'll typically combine this with riposte or more crit in your build. Precog is just where you're focusing on crit now, and by nature, Grenade Veteran is not a crit build because bleed can never crit. It just cannot crit. Bleed also always takes the torso for the purpose of damage and enemy armor type. So precog works best with weak spots, so you get the multiplicative scaling, but we just don't care about that with Grenade Veteran. We really don't. We care about base damage and armor penetration. That's what we typically care the most about, or a way to ramp and maintain those bleed stacks if we can't ramp it. Riposte is good. Again, if you're combining it with a serrated blade, you can get a lot of front loaded damage, but again, it just comes down to now you're just playing heavily into crit and focusing on it. It's not needed. Between Reciprocity, that's 25% crit chance. Between Desperado, that's 35% crit chance. Veteran at a base has a 5% crit chance innately, so you're at 40%. We're typically taking the mini node above Grenadier for another 5%, so we're at 45% chance. And then the knife, if I'm not mistaken, has an innate 10% crit chance, if not 5. So if I'm not mistaken, and I'm pretty sure it's 55, not 50, but you'll be at 55% crit chance with a crit centered or crit focused build, more or less, as far as Grenade Veteran goes, making blessings like Flesh Terror still be very, very valuable. Do I need to go to 75%? No, I don't think so. So it just gets redundancy points like precog in my opinion. But all in all, combat knife, fantastic weapon, one of my favorites, if not my favorite, truthfully. I've got the most experience on the knife for sure. When I'm not sure, I just go back to the knife. It's my default weapon of choice. Now onto the Dueling Sword. We all know this weapon's absolutely cracked, doesn't matter what mark you're taking. Mark 4 has the best carapace damage, Mark 2 is a balanced weapon, Mark 5 has the best mobility, Mark 4 is just going to be the easiest and most consistent, so just go with the Mark 4. So in terms of blessings, you've got Agile to maintain those dodge stacks. Every time you hit a weak spot, you refresh your dodge efficiency. That is just ridiculously powerful. On top of that, you get a little bit of weak spot damage, little cherry on top, we take those. Much like the combat knife, Uncanny Strike will be the best in slot, so you'll take this with or in combination with any of the other blessings. Thrust is great if you're not running a crit build, so if you're not taking any crit in your build, and when I say any crit, I'm talking Reciprocity and Desperado. It's quite natural to take the 5% node above Grenadier, but that's not enough crit chance to just say, okay, I'm going to take a crit centered blessing now, not worth. However, you can, unlike the knife, riposte and Uncanny does get a lot of value. You can rock around with that 50 to 70% crit chance. You can start front loading your damage, and basically you can play for, 2 heavy pokes for every 1 thrust poke, and it will be much higher DPS as well. But again, you have to take into the crit. Riposte and Uncanny is my favorite way to run the Dueling Sword currently, although I will say Agile is quite powerful as well. Precog is okay, but going back to the knife, it's too much of an investment into crit. It's not needed. Uncanny is best in slot, so that always stays. So then you would have to invest in the riposte, now not leaving a slot for precog. If you're an Auric Maelstrom or below, you don't need Uncanny, but God is my witness, trust me, it's worth taking. Rampage, same problem with the Power Sword. It does not affect bleed damage. Little reason to take it. You're taking Rampage more so for the light attacks to deal with Horde. I can understand the reasoning, but it's not needed. And Serrated Blade does the same thing, but will have more application, will still work against the big elites and helps most first bosses. Havoc is absolutely full of bosses at the moment, making bleed even more important for that uptime. And because of things like the purple elites, keeping maximum or as high bleed stacks as possible to keep that ramp so they tick down as fast as possible is important. You don't want to just 6 stacks and then the last tick takes it into the healing node or the enraged state, for example, and then you've got no more bleed stacks and you start whacking something else. That's not the way to do it in Havoc anymore. You really want to maintain and focus down everything. Serrated Blade does help for that. Rampage not so much. Definitely on the weaker end of Blessing. Now going on to the A tier, Shovel and Shockmaw are of equal power. What separates the two is the Shockmaw is the stronger base weapon. However, the Shovel is a much more powerful force multiplier to grenades because of the blessings it has access to. When you have grenade downtime, Shockmaw is going to be better. When you have grenades, Shovel's going to be better. It's that simple, and I prefer these over the chain axe because of the mobility. Simple as that. Now going with the Shovel, it has access to Uncanny Strike, best in slot for Grenade Veteran, and it has access to All or Nothing. It's an incredibly easy condition to stack for Grenade Veteran because when you see the horde coming, you dump 2-3 grenades, you dodge back, and then you just start pushing. Once you get to that 20 to 0% stamina, that's when you go start whacking stuff, and you're just basically again front loading so much damage into those grenades. Very powerful. If you want less grenade focus and more single target focus, Skull Crusher is just as powerful as All or Nothing. It will give higher damage to the enemies that you apply Skull Crusher to, but All or Nothing will give you far more AoE damage. It just depends on how you want to focus your Shovel, but Uncanny and All or Nothing or Skull Crusher are typically going to be the best combination of blessings, with Uncanny being best in slot. Honorable mentions to Decimator. It's okay, it's easy to lose stacks, so the uptime is not consistent, and Decimator does not improve bleed damage unfortunately, so no grenade synergy there. Thrust is nice, but it's redundant and nowhere near as good as Skull Crusher or All or Nothing in a grenade build. It's just redundant with the Shovel truthfully. Going into the Shockmaw, high voltage, great blessing. So perks on weapons improve bleed damage. They are base damage add-ons to your build. High voltage is just basically a 25% damage increase to any enemy armor type, whether you're just hitting them with normal attacks or using the special. While they're getting hit, shocked, you're going to be benefiting from that damage. Overall, it's a pretty good blessing to have. Now, Opportunist is going to be best in slot for the Shockmaw because the way Opportunist works is it doesn't matter what staggers the enemy. As long as they are staggered and they have damage from you applied, you will get the 25% rending. So what am I trying to say? Let's say an Ogre Bull charges through enemies and I throw a grenade while they're staggered. All of my bleed stacks will be benefiting from that 25% rending, which is essentially half of a red combat stim all the time. It is extremely powerful with a build like Grenade Veteran that does so much AoE damage. On top of the fact the Shockmaw is good at applying stagger, plus we have the stagger from grenades, plus we have the stagger from voice of command. We can set up our own Opportunist, let alone if we have any Ogrens or any Zealots with Choir or even Psychers with Venting Shriek. There is just a lot of uptime to Opportunist. Don't leave home without it on the Shockmaw. Skull Crusher is absolutely goated on the Shockmaw. A lot of stagger. It's pretty much what you're going to be comboing with it more often than not. Thrust, no grenade synergy, much like the other weapons. Thrust never improves bleed damage. It's okay, but just not as good as Skull Crusher or High Voltage. Both of those other blessings, High Voltage and Skull Crusher, improve bleed damage. Now going on to one of my favorite weapons, just in terms of immersion, it just feels awesome to play, the Chain Axe. This has got some pretty crazy synergies. So first one is Bloodletter. You'll typically combo this with Thunderous, and this will allow one-shot breakpoints even in Havoc 40 against Crushers. Being able to maintain and apply bleed stacks, especially the current Havoc, is very single target focus. It's very important to make sure you don't leave elites in the enraged state or keep purples alive so they constantly heal. The Chain Axe is just great for comboing with grenades, which grenades by nature are great at dealing with a horde. It's just a great weapon to, in 2 steps, grenades and your melee weapon, have a full rounded build. Now if you don't want to take Bloodletter and Thunderous, you can still take Head Taker to help with the horde control. It has most effect with the Mark 12's light spam or the heavy and push attack spam of the Mark 4. It unfortunately does not improve bleed damage damage, but it will help with the weapon overall. Opportunist, just like I said with the shock maul, this is going to be your best in slot blessing, and it will still contribute and help to those one-shot breakpoints. So I prefer Opportunist over Thunderous. Yes, Thunderous helps your team, but the fact that I can apply Opportunist to a screen of bleeding enemies, it kind of makes it no contest in my opinion. Also note that on the Mark IV, the lights do count as staggered enemies, so you're benefiting on the Mark IV lights or on the special rev for both marks. Slaughterer is just a better version of Head Taker for Grenade Veteran. It 1 allows for higher damage, but 2 also improves bleed damage. So if you have the choice of one or the other, Head Taker or Slaughterer, it's always going to be Slaughterer. Opportunist and Slaughterer on the chain axe are a great place to start, or you can replace Slaughterer for Bloodletter if you want the bleed stacks. If you're taking Serrated Blade, just go Slaughterer. Thrust, another one, it plays well, but it's not needed. You'll typically find it hard to fit over other blessings because it doesn't improve bleed damage. That's just how it is. All in all, some great blessings to use. One to improve the weapon for Grenade Veteran builds in general, but also great for Shredder Ramp as well. Now going on to the B tier, I do think both of these weapons are on par with each other. These are two weapons that have just truly stood the test of time, on Grenade Veteran at least anyway. Starting with the Combat Axe, both the Antax and the Rashad are fantastic weapons. The Achilles has a little bit too much focus in single target and is kind of let down in the horde clear. Unironically, Grenade Veteran helps solve that, so really take whatever version of axe you want. I find the most success with the Rashad personally, but I like all of them. Now, best in slot for the Combat Axe will be All or Nothing. All of them have great push attacks. All or Nothing is one of, if not the second best blessing for Grenade Veteran after Uncanny Strike, and it will still contribute to those 1-2 shot breakpoints against horde killing, which is why you would take, for example, Brutal Momentum and Head Taker. Now, I'm typically comboing All or Nothing with Brutal Momentum or Bromentum. Really ramps up that horde killing with the combat axes. Pretty much the two blessings I'll always take on these weapons. You can change All or Nothing for Decapitate if you're going a more crit focused build. It's alright. I'm just putting it there as an option because it's not bad, but again, now you're playing more into crit and taking away from potential grenade investment like All or Nothing, so I don't think it's worth it, but it's still a decent option. Decimator is stronger than Head Taker when it's fully stacked, but it has less consistency in its uptime and doesn't improve bleed damage, so I'd rather go with All or Nothing, which has an easier mechanic to trigger. Head Taker, much like Decimator, doesn't improve bleed damage, but it will contribute to important breakpoints for horde killing, but again, I can just go All or Nothing and play into those push attacks to dump my stamina. And honorable mentions to Shred, Thrust, Thunderous, they're alright, but I wouldn't really care about them compared to the other options. Just depends, there's some builds where it can be more useful, but for the most part, you're going to be going Bromentum and All or Nothing, or Bromentum and Head Taker. Bonus points if you're combining it with a ranged weapon that's already good with armor, or something like the Hellbore that has access to Armor Bane. Now you've really got a weapon that can deal with all situations. The Turtolsky Heavy Sword, I have no idea how to pronounce that. That's my best, that's what you're going to get from me. Now, Blade of Momentum will be best in slot, just like Uncanny and Opportunist is for the other weapons, but Blade of Momentum is typically going to be the weakest because it's got the hardest mechanic to trigger, it's got the least uptime, and it's just in general weaker, but it still has a lot of use cases. So let's say you see a Crusher Bulwark pack coming, but there's a horde in front of you, you can throw grenades in advance and start stacking Blade of Momentum, so when those grenades go off, they're already benefiting from the rending. The Heavy Sword deals with armor by boosting shredders, not because it's necessarily good against carapace. There's two good marks. The IX is what everyone uses. There's another mark that has a poke push attack. That is personally my favorite because it deals the best with carapace, and then grenades naturally already do well with hordes. It's just a great generalist weapon. Death Blow is great. It's basically the Heavy Sword's version of Brutal Momentum. Helps with that horde kill, but isn't really needed on the Heavy Sword compared to the Combat Axe. Head Taker, again, great blessing. You're typically going to be combining Blade of Momentum with Head Taker, but there's no bleed scalings. Like I mentioned before, Rampage is the same issue. Thrust is the same issue. There's no bleed scalings with any of these three blessings, but all of them are pretty decent with Blade of Momentum. And then finally, you have Wrath if you really want to play heavily into that AoE horde clear. I think it's a little overkill though. Now going on to the C tier, I think both of these weapons are on par. Now the Tactical Axe, again, this is just a crit focus focus weapon, so much like the revolver and the vigilant autogun in my ranged tier list. Watch that. There's going to be a similar issue here. It's a weapon that wants to play around crit, but Grenade Veteran doesn't care about focusing on crit, but it welcomes crit. We want some, but to the point where the tack axe will truly shine, that's too much of an investment. Now you're just pulling too much investment from grenades. However, all or nothing will be the best in slot for the tactical axe. At least you can get some shredder ramp through dumping stamina. The push attack on the Mark 7 is pretty good, combining with heaviest for horde clear. You can combine that with agile if you want a bit more mobile and defensive stats. You will hurt your horde clear, but you can just meat grinder enough enemies one at a time where it's a decent enough trade-off. Brutal momentum with all or nothing is typically what I'm taking just to get the maximum horde kill. You'll still contribute to those important 1-2 shot breakpoints. Decimator and Head Taker are good replacements for all or nothing. Head Taker will have the easiest mechanic to trigger and maintain uptime. All or nothing, you need to be paying attention to your stamina, and it is quite the aggressive playstyle, so you'll need a little practice. You won't be able to rely on your blocks, for example. You'll be constantly out of stamina and then stagger yourself, so you need to play around dodges heavily, not blocking, but you use your block attacks to trigger the dump stamina mechanic. It just requires a little bit more finesse, but all or nothing is more powerful. And then finally, Decimator, it does have the highest peak, but the lowest consistent uptime, and it doesn't improve bleed damage. I think it's the weakest of the 3 damage blessings that you can use for the tack axe. Alright, now going on to the chainsaw, similar to the tack axe, this really shines when you're getting trench fighter, reciprocity, desperado weapon specialist, really ramping that attack speed and light spamming. Bloodletter's okay, serrated blade's okay with it. Where this weapon truly struggles is armor, and Grenade Veteran by nature already does well with hordes, so this weapon is just doing something that Grenade Veteran is already the best at, so it's got a lot of redundancy points, but I do think the weapon is still okay and can still contribute to armor damage, but it's just not, there's not much synergy, I'll be honest. Bloodletter is always good. Getting max or close to max bleed stacks will help against the carapace. Combining that with spamming lights, hoping their crits on weak spots, that's basically how you're going to deal with crushes. It's not that great. You can combine with rampage, but again, that's not ramping your bleed damage, but will help your horde kill. You can go shred and rampage, for example, if you just want to play as much damage as possible. You can also go wrath and rampage if you're not playing into the crit, but you still want as much horde clear as possible. And that's basically where the blessings end for this weapon. Nothing actually improves bleed damage at all on this weapon, but it can still get the job done. I just do recommend combining it with a range weapon that can definitely deal with armor, because the chainsaw, when you get like 20 crushes and 20 maulers and like 10-15 rages and fucking 50 to 100 poxwalkers and groaners and all that bullshit, deal with armor then with the chainsword, it's gonna fucking struggle. However, I don't think it's as bad as the Devil Claw, which is a real shame, because in Auric Maelstrom the Devil Claw is actually quite the strong weapon, except for when you get into those CIVI missions. When armor starts coming, it's gonna start struggling even more than the chainsword, because it can't rely on its light as much as the chainsword. On top of that, the parry still costs stamina. Everything in Havoc hits so fucking hard that it just dumps your stamina anyway. I think the Devil Claw is truly a weapon that shines in Auric Maelstrom and below, but then gets outshined by everything in Havoc because there's just too much carapace for it to truly deal with. It really needs a rending blessing for this weapon to get any use in Havoc, in my opinion. Whether they even just want to give it blade of momentum so it can still do something, that will probably boost this weapon straight into the B tier, but without it, it has to remain in the D tier. It's just not good. Again, primarily talking from a Havoc perspective. So what it does have is rampage, but there's no grenade bleed scalings there. It has shred, but we don't care. Grenade Veteran is not a crit focused build. Skull Crusher will be the best in slot, and it's the only redeeming thing of this weapon for Grenade Veteran. I mean, the parries are pretty nice, but again, you can't always play around the parries because it's going to dump your stamina. You're kind of locked into that animation, and you can still get hit after the animation is recovering. That's the dangerous part. Thunderstrike is okay, but if I'm going to go Thunderstrike, just chuck it on the shock more. There's really no reason I'd want it on the Devil's Claw. Wrath is good, especially if you're combining it with something like Rampage or Skull Crusher. I was either doing Skull Crusher and Rampage or Skull Crusher and Wrath, but having no access to any rending blessings and already being incredibly weak to Carapace, this just does not offer Grenade Veteran anything that it cares about, because by nature Grenade Veteran is already king shit at dealing with hordes. So it's so much redundancy, and then it doesn't shore any of the weaknesses. So for that reason, I'm gonna be putting the Devil Claw in the D tier. If it got access to Uncanny Strike, even Opportunist or Blade of Momentum, I'd 100% put this weapon up. Much like the Chain Axe, much like the Tack Axe, or even the Combat Axe. If the Combat Axe got access to Uncanny Strike, for example, holy shit, I'd have so much fun with that. But again, because grenades are so good at dealing with human-sized elites and non-armored elites, which there is a lot of, what you're really looking for in a weapon is, can it improve dealing with armor? And that's kind of where you'll find the tier list is heavily skewed. The better it is at dealing with armor and how versatile it is after that, kind of is where the strongest weapons are going to be scaling down. But that's the end of my tier list. I hope I explained everything well. I tried to keep it as quick and concise as possible. Again, this will be followed by my Darktide interactions, which will again try to be as quick as possible, just show you everything. And then I want to go back into my builds and gameplay videos. I want to get some other things done, but that's a story for another time. I hope you enjoyed. God bless. Catch you in the next video. 07.